Well, good evening, everybody. I hope everyone's having a good week. I appreciate you being here to study the Bible with us. A few brief thoughts about the study we have coming up in a couple of weeks. In the book of Luke, keep in mind that Luke and Acts are kind of a two-parter. What's interesting about that is that you have the same writer, that is Luke, and he is writing the story of Jesus in a way that is somewhat unique from the other gospel writers. And then he has a part two to that about the founding of the church, the spread of Christianity in its early days. And to see how those two fit together so seamlessly, that is, I think, a really good foundation for the rest of our Bible learning. It's a long process to get to those two books. I think I saw that, I forget the exact number, but it's almost 30% of the whole New Testament was written by Luke just in those two books. And so that's a lot of material. And so I'm bringing that up to say that in 2 Wednesdays from now, not next Wednesday, but the one after, the first Wednesday in December, we'll be starting that study. And as always, I want to recommend that you go ahead and start reading the book of Luke. I mean, we're going to take probably several weeks to cover that first chapter with how long it is. But go ahead and be reading the first chapter or two, or however much you want to read. Read it several times. Get familiar with it. Think of questions that you have. Think of things that have fascinated you about that study. And go ahead and I'd encourage you, if you're planning on being here for those studies, go ahead and be reading the book of Luke and getting very familiar with it. And I think that will make our study together more profitable. So thank you for your interest in that. This evening we're going to have a one-off lesson because next week is the Wednesday right before Thanksgiving, and I believe tradition around here is to keep that to a 30-minute devotional. And so we'll not have a Bible class next Wednesday, but we will be here for a devotional. And so what I wanted to do this evening is try my best to address what many have called the toughest question for Christians to answer. That is, the toughest question that is often presented from the critics of Christianity, namely atheists and agnostics, when they say God does not make sense, or the idea of God does not make sense, or the existence of God does not make sense. And when you ask an atheist to give their absolute best argument, for instance, Richard Dawkins, if you are familiar with that name, somebody who's not only an atheist, somebody who is one of the world's leading scientists, but what sets Richard Dawkins apart is he is so aggressive at his attack against Christianity that he is one of the thorns in Christian side in modern day. He is from the UK, and maybe you've come across his content on the internet, but when asked, if you had one argument to disprove the existence of God, which argument would you use? And he has said on multiple occasions, the reality of evil, pain, and suffering in this life disproves God. And he says that's the argument that I would use. He's not unique. Anthony Flew had that same argument. This was a prominent atheist back in the day. And many people have given that answer. I've asked the question to those who work in apologetics, what is the most challenging question that we as Christians get from the critics of Christianity? And they say, well, the problem of evil, pain, and suffering. And so I want to do our best to address that question this evening. And there's really two things. I understand when we talk about a subject like this, it can be overly academic to the point of being insensitive. I understand that because maybe the person listening we're all coming from different perspectives. Maybe the person listening to a discussion on this topic, maybe they're the critic. And they say, now I believe this puts a logical fallacy behind the existence of God. Therefore, I'm listening from an intellectual, logical, reasonable perspective, and I'm trying to see which side in the court of law has the best evidence for it. There's many people who will approach this subject in that way. I think that sometimes we're so gung-ho about going that direction that, especially us as preachers, we forget that we are working with real people. And real people, all of us, we experience evil and pain and suffering. And we don't want to make the topic of evil, pain, and suffering solely an academic discussion, because if I'm hearing this discussion about evil, pain, and suffering, and it's so cold and logical, I understand why it has to be that way sometimes, but I'm sitting here dying of cancer, well, that doesn't really set very well. So I acknowledge that there's multiple approaches we can take in this subject, and so when someone asks me, and it's a question I get quite a bit, in comparison to other questions I've received, when someone asks me about the problem of evil, pain, and suffering, I often try to stop. I haven't always done this. I often try to stop and think before responding to that question, and I ask the question, number one, who is asking this question? Who is asking this question? Is it a Christian who is going through hard times and seeking encouragement and comfort? Or is this a critic of God or a critic of Christianity? Is it a believer or is it an atheist? There is a good chance that they have very different motives in asking that question. It is also essential to ask, why are you asking me this question? I remember the last time I was faced with that exact question. It was a few months ago. And someone said, TJ, and they presented the traditional argument that we'll get into in a moment of the problem of evil, pain, and suffering. And I haven't always done this, but I remember stopping and trying to be sensitive and say, can I ask you why you're asking me that question? Because from my perspective, studying the Bible, studying some apologetics, going to a preaching school its specialty was apologetics, my first instinct is to jump into rationale, logical debate mode and give a solid answer to the critics of Christianity. And I was geared to do that, but I'm glad I said, why are you asking me this question? And they say, well, because I'm going through some hard times. Well, I'm not going to answer them the same way I would if they were coming at it from an attack position, right? And so I want to acknowledge that at the outset and say that we will on multiple occasions have plenty of lessons in the future about going through hard times, dealing with struggles, how to cope with life's difficulties. I think that's, one of the most important things that I think I can preach on, because, because we go through hard times and we don't always feel comfortable expressing that. For the purpose of this study, though, I want to narrow the focus to the argument as though we are dealing with the critic. Okay? Just understand, I'm not trying to be insensitive. If you're going through hard times, let's have those discussions. I'll be open to talking about those things. But for the purpose of this study from this point going forward, I would like to just make it clear that we're going to try to give a logical, rational explanation to the reality of evil, pain, and suffering. And so, in this lesson, we will look at the Christian's response to evil and suffering from two standpoints. Number one, or from this primary standpoint of how to answer the critic. So, how do we answer the critic? Let's talk about how the argument is traditionally proposed. The atheistic argument, understand, is an emotional argument. The argument that we're about to present is an emotional argument. Don't give the person who is attacking the existence of God the upper hand by operating and trying to answer these questions from a standpoint of emotion. You'll understand what I mean in just a moment. And so understand the atheistic argument of evil, pain, and suffering that is meant to try to disprove the existence of God. Understand at the outset what it is. It can be seen on the surface as a rational argument, but really it is an emotional argument. Acknowledging that gets us a long way. The atheistic argument of evil, pain, and suffering goes something like this. And by the way, I'm going to present it the way that I have heard it presented by college and professors. I'm going to present it the way that some teacher at some point is going to present it to your kids, okay? Or to you. You've probably experienced this as well. I remember one story of a person that I know who went to a college class his freshman year, one of his first classes, and the teacher said, "Who in here believes in God?" And I don't know, a portion of the students raised their hand. I don't know the exact number or the percentage of students. And the professor goes on to say, to those of you who did not raise your hand, good job. To those of you who did raise your hand, by the time you're done with this class, you're no longer going to be able to rationally believe in God. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you at the outset that by the time you've sat through all 18 weeks of my class, if you still believe in God, it's not because it makes sense, it's because of your own stubbornness. He said something like that. That probably doesn't surprise you, but we need to be reminded of how this is presented in the world in general. We're often made to believe by certain circles that you're backwoods, uneducated, outdated, behind the times, not scientific, if you believe in God still. I mean, do you still believe in Santa Claus? Do you believe the Easter Bunny delivers a basket of candy? Do you believe in God? It's packaged in that way. That's the way it's packaged. And the argument that in this particular example that I'm thinking of, the professor put forth goes like this. It's the traditional argument that we're trying to deal with this evening. He says, okay, to you who raised your hand and said you believe in God, I presume because of our culture that you believe in the God of the Bible. And nearly everyone said yes. Okay, let me ask you a question, he says. The God of the Bible, is He all-powerful? And what do you think we say to that question? Is He all-powerful? I see some head shaking. I'm convinced He's absolutely all-powerful. Okay, the God that you believe in, you're telling me, this is the professor speaking, you're telling me that He is all-powerful. Therefore, He has the power to do anything He wants to do, and we as Christians may add, as long as it's according to His will, yes. Okay, the God that you believe in, is He a God of love? And the Bible answer to that is what? Yes, God is love. We are told in the book of 1 John. Okay, so let me get this straight. The God that you believe in, He is all-powerful and He is the most loving being in all the universe. He only wants what's good for you, right? Yes. Okay, the third question is there evil in this world? Yes. People get murdered. People get abused. People get raped. People get kidnapped. People have been enslaved throughout history. Yes, evil exists. Is there suffering in this world? Is there anyone who suffers? Yes, go to a cancer ward or a cancer wing of a hospital and look at the suffering that they go through. Yes, there is evil in this world, and yes, there is suffering in this world. Okay. If your God is as loving as you say He is, wouldn't He want to stop all of that suffering? And if He is as powerful as you say He is, wouldn't He have the power to do something about it? What do you think a 18-year-old kid's going to say? They're going to be left, many, not all, many are going to be left dumbfounded at this question. And by the way, this is not just a problem for first-time college students, this is a problem for everybody because we're all watching TV and all on the internet and we all see the critics and what they have to say. And the critic would say, okay, if your God really is all-loving and if He really is all-powerful, and since there hasn't been a complete cease to all of the pain and suffering and evil in this world, that must logically mean, that logically leads us to conclude that either your God isn't all-powerful, or maybe He is and can stop it, but He chooses not to. Therefore, He doesn't love you. He's not the loving God you think He is. Or maybe He's neither, or maybe He doesn't even exist. Do you think that line of reasoning will work on some people? Do you think it has? And so we as Christians need to know why we believe what we believe. Do I believe in God? Yes. But I don't believe in God out of just wishful thinking. I don't believe in God because there's no good reason behind it. I have struggled with the idea of God at times in my life, and I can tell you that I believe in God not because I just want to. I believe in God because the evidence is so compelling that it leads me in that direction overwhelmingly. And so how do we as Christians deal with this criticism, and how do we instruct our kids to deal with this criticism? I think that's a very important part of this discussion. It is best to make the distinction between the word evil and the word suffering. For instance, the word evil refers to that which is morally corrupt, right? It refers to that which is wrong, that which is opposite of right. And it's worth noting that evil only happens in this world because of people's choices. God does not perform any evil. From the Christian perspective, we read the passage just a little bit ago in James chapter 1. God is not tempted with evil, nor does He tempt anyone. If evil exists, the biblical position would be that it does not come from God. Therefore, if evil exists, then it must come from the choices of others. So understanding the difference between the word evil and the word suffering is very important here. Go with me to the book of Genesis, chapter 6, and verse number 5. You probably know what this passage is. Yeah, go ahead.
Also, Satan can't make us perform evil.
Exactly.
He can influence us if we allow him.
Yep.
But he can't make us.
Yeah, Genesis 6 and verse number 5. I could spend a whole lot of time talking about that, but I agree with that point wholeheartedly. I was asked a question on one occasion, TJ, where does sin come from? Or where did sin come from? I think if we're not careful, we're tempted to give an oversimplified answer that the Bible really doesn't give us, and that is, sin came from the devil. No, actually, the Bible doesn't teach that. I mean, the Bible teaches that sin is a result of human beings who are under a particular law of God, who make the choice to rebel against that law and act in contradiction to that law. Law breaking, that's what sin is. So Eve, then Adam, brought sin into the world in which we know. Why did they sin? Did Satan make them? Did he force them? Did he have power over them? No. He simply, I forget the word I'm looking for, he took advantage of a weakness that they had, and the weakness they had was sometimes they desired to do what God told them not to do. I remember being a kid. I love food as much as anybody, and I remember the cookie jar being set way out of reach, and I wasn't even thinking of the cookie jar until she said, "Don't touch the cookie jar." And as soon as she said what I could not do, what did that make me want to do all the more? Well, Adam and Eve were told, it wasn't the only command, of course, but of the trees of the knowledge, you can eat of all of them, but of this tree you shall not eat it, or the day you'll eat it, you'll die. We know the story, so sin happened as a consequence of free will and a choice, and that's a part of our discussion this evening. It connects to what you said. And that's kind of where we're going in Genesis chapter 6 and verse number 5. And when we're talking about evil is due to people's choices. In Genesis 6 and verse 5, you may even have this memorized. The Bible said in the days of Noah, then the Lord saw, underline it, the Lord saw, that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only, what's the word it uses? Evil continually. Now go with me to the New Testament book of Romans. Romans chapter 5 and verse number 12. Notice what Romans 5:12 says here in connection to all of this. Romans 5:12 says, therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men because all have sinned. And then one more passage, 1 John chapter 2 and verse number 15. You probably have this verse memorized also. 1 John chapter 2 and verse number 15. He says, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. And you go on to read in verse 16, for all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, it is not of the Father, but it is of the world. All we're pointing out at this stage, I don't want to get ahead of myself, is that where evil exists, it exists because human beings made a choice to act contrary to the will of God. That's what evil is. Understand, and we'll come back to it, that it isn't God who makes it happen. It doesn't happen by accident. It is the result of individuals' choices. That's important. Now, the word suffering, on the other hand, it refers to pain. Now, sometimes I experience pain that is not the result of my choice or anyone else's choice. It refers to pain. It refers to agony of the body and of the mind. Suffering is sometimes caused by evil choices, no doubt, but not always. You know, for instance, who made the evil choice when an earthquake wipes out a community, or a tornado, or a fire, or floods, or disease, so on and so forth? Real quickly, write down and read with me quickly John 16 and verse 33. I'm already going to tell you this might turn into a two-part study. We might spend the first class. We'll see. We'll see how it goes. In John 16 and verse number 30, John says, or here we see Jesus stating the following, where the Bible says the following. John 16:33 rather. He says, "These things I have spoken to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer, I have overcome the world." What does Jesus say? There's a lot that he says about peace and all of this, but he makes the simple statement that while you're in the world, you will go through hard times. While you're in the world, you will face difficulties, is the idea here. And I could reference James 1, 2 through 4 again that we read just a little bit ago. It isn't a matter of if we suffer trials, but we will inevitably suffer trials. And so it's important to decipher between the word evil and the word suffering. Some suffering happens because of the evil choices of others, but not all suffering does. And so why do these things happen? People's choices and the laws of nature. And so let's talk about choices for just a moment. Go with me to Galatians chapter 5. Galatians chapter 5 and verse 13. I'll put this together, I promise, or at least attempt to, and make all this make sense. In Galatians 5 and verse number 13, it's important to understand that we have the freedom of choice. This is one of the very first things that God gave us when He created us as human beings. In Galatians 5 and verse 13, the Bible says, "For you, brethren, have been called to liberty," that is the freedom we have in Christ, freedom from sin, "only do not use liberty," this freedom from sin, "as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another." Flip over to, in other words, the point is we have a choice in the matter. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 16, just trying to give you the necessary verses to build the case. And 1 Peter 2 and verse number 16, he says, "As free," this is about the same concept, being free in Christ. We have the freedom to choose. We have liberty in Christ, but don't use that liberty against to sin. He says in verse 16, "As free, yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice, but as bondservants of God." And he goes on to tell us to honor all. And so God is responsible for this fact, that we have the freedom of choice. That we cannot be human beings and not have the freedom of choice. Every one of us from the beginning of time had the freedom to choose. Adam and Eve could say, "I choose to honor God," or "I choose to dishonor God," and they did. They could choose to obey God or to disobey God, and they did. And so we all have that freedom of choice. But understand, though God is responsible for the fact of freedom, we humans are responsible for the acts of freedom. We have freedom. I can use that freedom to do good or to do harm. I can use that freedom to serve God or to disobey God, as we have just said. And along those lines, God did not make us robots. I think this is an important point to consider, and I know that you've considered this in your minds before. He does not force us to follow Him, right? I mean, He has never forced anyone in the Old Testament story throughout human history to follow Him. He makes it compelling. He says, "Look at how I've cared for you. Look at how I've loved you. Look at how I've offered salvation for you. Now I'm asking, will you come and follow me?" I mean, He makes it very, very, very compelling, but we have a choice in the matter. He doesn't force us. He doesn't program us. We're not robots that are programmed only to do right and never to do wrong. We have a choice in the matter. There is no freedom without personal choice. Neither is there love without personal choice. You know, if you are married, you understand this. If your spouse is with you because they are made to be with you, you can't call that love, can you? If you're only with your spouse because you have to be, that's not love. But love is when she chooses to want to be with me and I choose to want to be with her, and we mutually consent to comply with the laws of the land, but more importantly, the law of God, and we are bound together by God in this union called marriage because of that mutual consent. You can call that love. It's a choice. When we choose that is a reveal of a genuine relationship and of genuine love. You cannot have a real relationship without a choice. I cannot have real love without a choice. God did not want a bunch of programmed robots. He wanted a real relationship with us. He wants real love with us. He wants it to be love from Him coming to us and reciprocated, us loving Him back. And the only way that relationship with God can be real and truly built on mutual love is if we have the freedom of choice. That's the pro. You know what the con is? Because I have the freedom of choice, I also have the freedom to use it for harm, to use it for hurt, to use it for sin. I have the freedom of choice so that I can have a genuine, real, loving relationship with God. The negative to that is not everybody will use that choice in that way. Some people will use the choice to hurt others. And you know that that is true just by life's experience. And so don't undervalue the importance of our freedom of choice in this discussion. When we have freedom of choice, let me read that again. We have freedom of choice, but understand with that freedom there are pros and cons as we just stated. You know, what are some ways people use, let's go down this line of reasoning, okay? People say there's evil, pain, and suffering in the world. All right, so let's look at some examples. Real life stories that come to my mind. I once knew of a mother, a young mother, who had a baby still in a car seat. They were driving home somewhere one evening, and a drunk driver collides into their car at night, hits them head on, and we've all heard, I don't have a specific story in mind, but I've heard stories like this, hits them head on, and both mother and baby dies. Does that happen sometimes in this old world we live in? Does that happen sometimes? When that happens, or tragedies like that happen, I have heard people in my hearing and in my presence say, I cannot believe God allowed that to happen. Or someone will say, God, what were you thinking? Why did you take them from me? I think sometimes as Christians we're guilty of using harmful language, and this language that Christians have been known for using, I guess God just took him from us. Now I'm not saying that never happens, but to assume that every time someone passes tragically, God just decided He was going to take them from us, that's putting blame or burden on God that we cannot put on God. Let's be very logical about, or first of all, let's be very caring about it. Is that tragic? Yes. My heart goes out to people in that circumstance. But can we really shake the fist at God and say, God, look at what you did? Or can we be very brutally honest about it and say, that man who was driving that car, who decided to drink that alcohol to the point of getting drunk, who drove 60 miles an hour down a backcountry road, who rammed head on to that vehicle with those innocent people inside, resulting in their death, can we not at least admit that he has also, like you and I, the freedom of choice, and he used that freedom of choice in a harmful, destructive, irresponsible way that ended up impacting others? Sometimes the suffering, imagine being the husband or the father. Imagine being the parents or the grandparents. They're going to go on and suffer for years upon years upon years over this tragedy. Is it God's fault or is it the drunk driver's fault? We know the answer to that, don't we? The answer is that the man made a foolish choice and the suffering happened because of the poor choices of others. Sometimes I suffer because of my own foolish choices. I don't particularly like soda. I drink it some. But I knew a guy in preaching school that drunk a 12-pack of Cokes by himself every day. I said, Rick, you're going to die of diabetes, brother. What are you doing? If I drink, I don't know, I'm not a doctor, Eddie could speak on this more, but if I drink a 12-pack of soda every day and I ended up with diabetes a few years down the road, can I legitimately blame God for my foolish choice of leading me to that health problem? No, I can't. And you know the point we're getting at. Sometimes the suffering that we experience is because of our own foolish choices. And sometimes the suffering we go through is because of the foolish choices of others. Sometimes it's even those that we didn't directly know, like past generations. There's a whole lot of people, a whole lot of older men in my life that I have heard about who had exposure to asbestos early in their life. They didn't know the negative side effects of that, but they have negative health side effects of that years later. That is not God cursing them. That is the foolish choices of past generations. Okay, so we've introduced a two-part study. So let me put it this way. On one occasion, I remember having this discussion with an atheist, and the atheist said something like this: TJ, if your God is real, why doesn't He remove everything that is the cause of evil, pain, and suffering? And we went through this logic. Okay, let's talk about where does suffering come from? From my own foolish choices, from the foolish choices of others, from the foolish choices of past generations. We'll get to the natural laws of nature in just a moment, but very quickly, the laws of nature that God put in place, they have pros and cons also. I mean, because of the law of gravity that God has created, we're sitting here rather secure right now, right? But once in 99.9% of the time, gravity is a wonderful blessing. But if I find myself hiking down a trail in the woods and I get to running through the woods until I fall off the side of a cliff, on that occasion, does gravity work in my favor? No. I'll plummet to my death. And so the idea that God is behind all of the evil, pain, and suffering, that is a flawed way of thinking to begin with. When I was having this discussion with an atheist years and years ago, he says, TJ, if your God would just remove everything in this life that causes evil, pain, and suffering, maybe I'd believe in Him. And I said, no, you wouldn't. Because if He did that, you wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be here. The Bible says in Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. The reality that I sometimes have used my freedom of choice to hurt others intentionally or unintentionally. The fact that I have used my freedom of choice, or anyone could say this, to create difficult circumstances in this life. If God did away with all evil, pain, and suffering, He'd have to remove every human from off the face of planet Earth. And so we're just trying to plant the seeds of this discussion being a little bit more nuanced than what some would like to make it. And, there's more that can be said here. If you give me 3 more minutes, I might be able to. Is it okay if I spend my next class covering this? Is that okay, elders, if we postpone Luke for 1 more week? If that's okay, we'll do that, okay? Any questions or comments you have at this point? So, go ahead. Right.
And that's just nature. It wasn't any choices that they made or did that caused all that suffering.
That is true.
That suffering will continue for a very long, long time. But it's just the world we live in. I mean, to me, if somebody says there's no God because there's pain and suffering, well, then they might as well say there's no world because of pain and suffering, because it causes pain.
That's true. Yeah. So let me recap what we've said, then I'll bring it to a close, and I'll go ahead and plan to finish this lesson before we jump into Luke. And that is that, why did God create earth? Why did He create earth? Everything He created on day 1 was to help sustain that which He created on day 2. And everything He created on day 1 and 2 was to sustain that which He would create on day 3, and so on and so forth. And everything He would create on days 1 through 6 was to sustain what He would ultimately create in His own image, and that is human beings, you and I. And when He created us in His own image, and He says, this is the prize of my creation, behold, it's very good, He set man and woman aside, and He says, you, not the animals, not the sea creatures, not the birds, not the insects, but you will have dominion over the face of the earth. Rule it. And now I want you to reproduce, create a lot of offspring, and fill the earth. That's what He did. So the planet is here for human beings, for you and I. Okay, why are we here though? We are here because God is so full of love, He wanted somebody to love. He wanted to pour His love out as much as He possibly could. And He wanted to be loved back by His creation. Not all of them would. Many would rebel. But there would be enough that would love Him back that it was worth creating all humankind. And the reality that we are even here in this planet living is a testament to the love of God. And the reality is there is no loving relationship between us and God unless we have freedom to love Him back and freedom to choose Him like He chose us. The consequences of that is sometimes people choose wrong. And those wrong choices result in evil, they result in pain, and they result in suffering. It's perfectly in alignment with the God of the Bible. It doesn't disprove the God of the Bible. We'll build on this in our next study. Let's go ahead and end there, and let me just ask, is there any final thoughts before we close?
I just think about Noah, because the world was completely full of, all humans were full of evil.
Yeah,
But there was one that made the choice,
that's right.
so he lived.
That's right.
And it's found because they chose to follow.
Exactly right. The freedom of choice is at the heart of this discussion. We'll pick this up in a couple of weeks, and we'll finish this. Hopefully it'll be beneficial to you. Thank you for your kind attention.